passion for sports occurred for me when I was 6 years old. We grew up, and my brother and I, in a town in Indiana of 600 people. It was spelled like La Fontaine, but it was pronounced by the locals La Fountain. And we had radio. It was the 1950s, and we listened to baseball games on the radio. And then we played baseball outside. And it was a different time, and kids would go to the high school field and play until 9, 10 o'clock at night, and then come home all on their own. No parents had to come by because you just knew everything was fine. And it was at that time I realized that I really loved sports. I liked being around it. Problem was, I was observant enough to know that my parents weren't athletes and that I probably wasn't going to be really good at that, but I listened to the radio and I thought, gee, what a good job if you got in free to do baseball games. And so that was my objective all along, was to be a baseball broadcaster, until in 1960 they took me to a hockey game in Fort Wayne. My brother and I had been pestering my parents, who were both school teachers, to go to see the Fort Wayne hockey team called the Comets, a minor league team. And so on December the 10th, 1960, we piled into a 1957 Plymouth station wagon and we went to see the Fort Wayne Comets play. And I am proud to say, not only did that game change my life around to my aspirations of wanting to be a hockey announcer, but the guy who broadcast the game that night, Bob Chase, is still to this day doing the Fort Wayne Comets. It's his 58th year. He is 83 years old, and he gives all of us a lot of hope. I think probably the hockey player that I admire most for his faith back through the years has been Chico Resch, and I think God put Chico in my path. Probably with a smile on his face at the time, because with the travel schedule that I had and the feeling that I had sometimes that it became well, that's it for that one, when's the next game? Chico brings a joy to life. I think one of the reporters that was covering the Devils over the years said, there's a guy who never gives you the idea he's ever had a bad day. Well, he has had, but you never sense that. And I think the contagious part of Glenn Resch is not the fact that he won a Stanley Cup with the New York Islanders in 1981, but the fact that he was traded after that, didn't let any of that, playing on poor teams at times during the rest of his career after being a hero with one of the Stanley Cup champions, ever changed him one iota. We like to kid him that George Washington has tears coming down his face before he gets out of Chico's wallet. And we kid him because he hits antique stores and collects lots of things like Coke trays with Coca-Cola personages on them, and old gas tanks that they had at filling stations that stand so high, and hockey cards, of course. But he has a faith that I think tells people, whether they know that he has a faith or not, that this is an unusual human being. He is a former player, and his work with the hockey chapels, I think, has been inspirational to a lot of us. And God only knows how many people that he has brought to the faith just by his example. I've been asked before what the most exciting game I ever called was, and at one time it became a top 10. It's probably a top 20 now. Here are a couple that just stand out in my mind. In 1998, in Nagano in the Olympics, they had admitted women's hockey for the very first time. And through history, this was like, if you're over 55 years of age, you remember the Brooklyn Dodgers, and you remember the fact they could never beat the New York Yankees, and they played each other every year, and they could never win, and it was just assumed they weren't going to. Then in 1955 they did. Well, the U.S. women had been playing Canada in women's ice hockey back to the early 1990s in world championships. They were never admitted to the Olympics. In every major competition, they would sweep their way to the final game and then get blasted by the Canadians. So this was something they wanted to change. So now we get to the gold medal game, and of course, Finland and Sweden and the other teams are playing for the bronze or lesser lights, and here it's the US and Canada again. And the morning skate before the gold medal game, the Canadians sent a backup goaltender and a couple of assistant coaches and scratch players. The entire U.S. team came about an hour later. And at one point, their coach, Ben Smith, was standing out on the ice, and the girls were all in a circle around him, down on one knee, looking up at him, and he was talking very quietly, and we had no idea what he was saying. Occasionally, there'd be some laughter, and then eventually they all parted and started resuming their practice and shooting pucks and so forth. And then he came over to where we were standing, and I was working with John Davidson at the time, and John said, "I know some of this is privilege, but can you let us in on what you were telling them?" He said, "I told them a golf story. I told them about the time when I was learning to play golf, and my ball would be on the green, and the guy I was playing with, his ball would be on the green, and he would be further from the pin. And I would always hope that he'd miss his shot, because if he did, that'd take the pressure off me. But then, as I got to be a better player, I'd hope he'd make his shot, because it would put pressure on me that I knew I could handle to make mine." That's where you are with Canada. They're going to bring a great game, but you can too, and you can win because you are just as good, if not better, than they are. And that night, for the first time, the U.S. women defeated Canada in a major competition. They had won a preliminary game in that same tournament, but they beat them with an empty net goal by a young lady named Sandra White. The final score was 3-1. Another Olympic game rather quickly, because most people remember it. It was in Vancouver, and it was the gold medal game in January of 2010. I beg your pardon, February of 2010. The United States was not shown a lot of respect by Canada. At least that's how the Americans perceived it, just as the women had in 1998. Here was a chance to finally show them by winning the first gold medal since the U.S. defeated the Russians and the Finns toward the end of the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid. But they're trailing 1-0, so they pull their goaltender, and a guy named Zach Parise scores in the last half minute of the game to tie it, and it goes into overtime. And there are so many chances at both ends of the ice. Predominantly Ryan Miller, the stoic goaltender of the Buffalo Sabres, stood tall and kept the U.S. in there. But then Sidney Crosby, being the magic man that he is, scored the overtime winner, in Canada took the gold medal. It was a great time for hockey. 37 million people in Canada watched it, but 37 million in the United States did too. And it was the most watched hockey game since back in 1980. And I was proud to have been there to see it, and I was also proud of how well the players from both teams conducted themselves, because that was the Olympic spirit. Afterwards, we talked to the losing goalie, Ryan Miller, and the winning goal scorer, Sidney Crosby. And had it been reversed, they would have both treated it the same way, whether they had won or whether they had lost, because it was class personified, and that's why that stands out as a memory for me.